I smoothed my skirt and took a deep breath, my hand hovering over the polished brass doorknob. The muffled voices from inside the conference room grew louder, and I caught snippets of heated discussion. This was it, the moment that would define my career. "Are you ready, Caroline?" Jackson's warm voice startled me. I turned to see my fiancé's reassuring smile, his blue eyes twinkling with pride. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, forcing a smile. "Let's do this." Jackson squeezed my hand and pushed open the door. The chatter inside ceased abruptly as we entered. All eyes turned to us, or rather to me. "Ah, there she is!" Mr. Thornton, the senior partner, boomed. "Caroline, we were just discussing your brilliant strategy for the Donovan case. Care to enlighten us further?" I stepped forward, acutely aware of the scrutiny from my colleagues. "Of course, Mr. Thornton, as I outlined in my brief." As I launched into my presentation, I couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. At 38, I was on the cusp of making partner at one of New York's most prestigious law firms. Years of hard work, sleepless nights, and sacrifices were finally paying off. But even as I spoke, a nagging doubt gnawed at the back of my mind. Was this really what I wanted? The engagement ring on my finger felt suddenly heavy, a reminder of the other major decision looming in my life. "Excellent work, Caroline," Miss Thornton said as I concluded. "I think we can all agree that with this strategy, victory is all but assured." A round of applause filled the room, and I basked in the moment of triumph. As the meeting adjourned, Jackson approached, beaming. "You were incredible," he whispered, pulling me into a quick embrace. "Mom's going to be so proud when she hears about this." My stomach clenched at the mention of Evelyn, Jackson's mother. Our last encounter flashed through my mind. Her perfectly coiffed hair, designer outfit, and razor-sharp smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Caroline, darling," she had purred, eyeing me up and down. "That's an interesting choice of outfit. I suppose it's practical for your work, isn't it?" I pushed the memory aside and focused on Jackson. "Thanks, honey. I'm just glad it's over. How about we celebrate tonight?" "Actually," Jackson said, his expression turning serious, "I was hoping we could have dinner with Mom. She's in town for a charity event and wants to discuss wedding plans." My heart sank. "Oh, I don't know, Jackson. I've got a lot of work to catch up on, and—" "Please, Caroline," he interrupted, his eyes pleading. "It would mean so much to me. You know how important family is, especially with Dad gone." I bit my lip, torn between my desire to avoid Evelyn and my love for Jackson. The mention of his late father, George, added another layer of complexity. There was something about George's death that never sat right with me, a family secret that seemed to linger just beneath the surface. "All right," I conceded, forcing a smile. "I'll make it work." Jackson's face lit up. "Great, I'll let Mom know. She'll be thrilled." As he walked away to make the call, I slumped against the wall, my earlier elation evaporating. The thought of enduring another evening with Evelyn filled me with dread. But I loved Jackson, and if this was what it took to build a life with him, I would find a way to manage. Little did I know that this dinner would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything I thought I knew about love, family, and the price of ambition. As I gathered my things and headed back to my office, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stepping onto a path from which there was no return. The restaurant buzzed with the quiet chatter of New York's elite, but all I could focus on was the sharp click of Evelyn's designer heels as she approached our table. Jackson stood, beaming, to greet his mother. "Mom, you look stunning as always," he said, kissing her cheek. Evelyn's eyes swept over me, her lips curling into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Caroline, dear, how nice to see you again." I stood, smoothing my dress. "Lovely to see you too, Evelyn. You look wonderful." "Oh, this old thing?" She waved a dismissive hand, diamond bracelet catching the light. "I just threw it on. Now tell me about this case you've been working on, Jackson. I hear it's quite impressive." As Jackson launched into an explanation of his latest legal triumph, I tried to quell the rising frustration in my chest. It was always like this with Evelyn. Jackson was the sun, and I was barely a distant planet in her eyes. "And what about you, Caroline?" Evelyn's sharp voice cut through my thoughts. "Any exciting cases on your docket?" I straightened, seizing the opportunity. "Actually, yes. I just won a major class action suit against—" "Oh, that's nice, dear," Evelyn interrupted, turning back to Jackson. Now about the wedding plans. I've been thinking. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of thinly veiled criticisms and pointed questions about my family, my career aspirations, and whether I was truly prepared for the responsibilities of being a Thornton wife. As we waited for dessert, Evelyn leaned in, her voice low. "Caroline, I hope you understand the importance of family in our circle. The Thornton name carries certain expectations." I nodded, forcing a smile. "Of course, Evelyn, I completely understand. Do you?" Her eyes narrowed. "Because I'm not entirely convinced you're ready for this life. Jackson needs a wife who can support his ambitions, not compete with them." My breath caught in my throat. Before I could respond, Jackson returned from the restroom, oblivious to the tension. "Everything okay here?" he asked, sliding into his seat. "Just fine, darling," Evelyn cooed. "I was just giving Caroline some motherly advice." As we left the restaurant, Evelyn pulled Jackson aside for a private word. I hung back, my mind reeling from the evening's events. How could I marry into this family? How could I spend the rest of my life trying to measure up to Evelyn's impossible standards? "Caroline?" Jackson's voice snapped me back to reality. "Mom's invited us for brunch at her place tomorrow. I told her we'd be there." My heart sank. "Jackson, I don't know if that's a good idea. I have a lot of work to catch up on, and—" "Please, Caroline," he pleaded, taking my hands in his. "It means so much to Mom, and to me." I looked into his earnest blue eyes and felt my resolve crumble. "All right," I sighed. "We'll go." Later that night, as Jackson slept peacefully beside me, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. There was something about Evelyn's behavior that didn't add up. The way she clung to Jackson, the secretive glances, the veiled comments about family expectations, it all pointed to something deeper, something hidden. And then there was the matter of Jackson's late father, George. Evelyn rarely spoke of him, and when she did, it was with a strange mix of reverence and, was it guilt? I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story of George's death than I'd been told. As dawn broke, I made a decision. I would go to brunch, but this time I'd be prepared. I reached for my phone, opening the voice recorder app. If Evelyn wanted to play games, I'd make sure I had evidence of every word. Little did I know, this simple act of self-preservation would set in motion a chain of events that would unravel the very fabric of the Thornton family and change my life forever. The shrill ring of my phone pierced the quiet of my office. Jackson's name flashed on the screen, and I felt a mix of excitement and dread. "Caroline, I've got news," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. "The firm's sending me to London for 3 months to handle the Blackstone merger." My heart skipped a beat. 3 months? Wow, Jackson, congratulations. I know it's sudden, but this is huge for my career. You understand, right? I swallowed hard, pushing down the conflicting emotions. Of course. When do you leave? Tomorrow morning, he replied. I'm sorry for the short notice. Can you meet me for dinner tonight? We can celebrate before I go. After hanging up, I leaned back in my chair, a wave of relief washing over me. 3 months without Evelyn's constant criticism and meddling. 3 months to clear my head and figure out what I really wanted. That evening, over candlelight and wine, Jackson's eyes sparkled as he talked about the opportunity. I tried to match his enthusiasm, but my mind kept wandering. You've been quiet, he said, reaching for my hand. Is everything okay? I forced a smile. Just thinking about how much I'll miss you. His face softened. I'll miss you too. But think of it this way, absence makes the heart grow fonder, right? As we said our goodbyes at the airport the next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that this separation was more than just a work trip. It felt like a crossroads. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of work and self-reflection. Without Jackson's constant presence, I found myself questioning everything. Our relationship, my career, the looming specter of Evelyn in our future. One evening, as I pored over case files in my living room, my phone buzzed with a text from Evelyn. Dinner tomorrow night. We need to discuss the wedding. No excuses. My stomach churned. I'd managed to avoid her for weeks, but I knew I couldn't put it off forever. Reluctantly, I agreed. The next night, I found myself seated across from Evelyn in an upscale restaurant, her perfectly manicured nails tapping impatiently on the table. Now, Caroline, she began, her voice dripping with false sweetness. With Jackson away, I thought it was time we had a little chat about your future in this family. I steeled myself. What about it, Evelyn? Her eyes narrowed. I'll be blunt. I'm not convinced you're the right fit for Jackson or for the Thornton name. I love Jackson, I said firmly. And he loves me. Evelyn laughed, a cold, brittle sound. Love? Oh, darling, love has nothing to do with it. Marriage in our circle is about alliances, about maintaining a certain standard. As she continued to list my perceived shortcomings, I felt something snap inside me. Enough, I said, my voice low but firm. I don't need your approval, Evelyn. Jackson and I— Jackson, she interrupted, doesn't know what's best for him. But I do. I've protected him his entire life, and I won't let you ruin everything I've built. Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. What do you mean, protected him? I asked, a chill running down my spine. Evelyn's face paled, realizing she'd said too much. Nothing. Forget I said anything. But I couldn't forget. As I left the restaurant, my mind raced. What was Evelyn hiding? What had she done to protect Jackson? Back in my apartment, I paced restlessly, unable to shake the feeling that I was on the verge of uncovering something big. On impulse, I picked up my phone and dialed a number I rarely used. Dad? I said when he answered. I need to ask you something about Jackson's father, George. There's something not right about his death, isn't there? The long pause on the other end of the line confirmed my suspicions. When my father finally spoke, his words sent a chill through me. Caroline, honey, he said gravely, there's something you need to know about the Thorntons, something that could change everything. As I listened to my father's revelation, I realized that my engagement to Jackson was about to become far more complicated than I could have ever imagined. The moment Jackson's plane touched down, my stomach twisted into knots. 3 months apart had done little to quell my anxiety about our future, especially after my father's cryptic revelations about the Thornton family. As I waited at the arrivals gate, my phone buzzed with a text from Evelyn. Dinner at our house tonight. No excuses. I grimaced, shoving the phone back into my pocket, just as Jackson emerged, his face lighting up at the sight of me. Caroline, he swept me into his arms, the familiar scent of his cologne washing over me. God, I've missed you. I melted into his embrace, momentarily forgetting my worries. I've missed you too. As we drove home, Jackson chattered excitedly about his time in London, but my mind was elsewhere. How could I tell him about my suspicions, about the conversation with my father? Caroline, Jackson's voice snapped me back to reality. Are you okay? You seem distracted. I forced a smile. Just tired. It's been a long day. He nodded, then reached into his pocket. Well, maybe this will wake you up. My heart stopped as he pulled out a small velvet box. Jackson, what? I've been thinking a lot while I was away, he said, his eyes shining, and I realized I don't want to waste another moment. Caroline, will you marry me? The world seemed to tilt on its axis. I stared at the glittering diamond, my mind racing. This was everything I'd thought I wanted, but now. Jackson, I began, but was cut off by his phone ringing. It's Mom, he said, answering. Hi, Mom. Yes, we're on our way. See you soon. He hung up, turning to me with an apologetic smile. Sorry about that. Mom's excited for dinner. We can celebrate our engagement there. My protest died on my lips as we pulled up to the Thornton mansion. Evelyn stood in the doorway, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Welcome home, darling, she cooed, embracing Jackson. Her gaze flickered to me, then to the ring box in Jackson's hand. Her smile tightened. I see congratulations are in order. Throughout dinner, I felt like I was suffocating. Evelyn dominated the conversation, half peppering Jackson with questions about London while pointedly ignoring me. I pushed my food around my plate, the weight of the unspoken secrets pressing down on me. So have you set a date? Evelyn asked, her tone deceptively light. Mom, I just proposed an hour ago, Jackson laughed. Well, it's never too early to start planning, she insisted. I was thinking a June wedding at the country club. Caroline, dear, I hope you don't mind if I take charge of the arrangements. After all, I have so many connections. Something inside me snapped. Actually, Evelyn, I do mind. The table fell silent. Jackson looked at me, bewildered. Caroline? I took a deep breath. There's something we need to discuss, all of us. Evelyn's face paled. I don't think this is the time or place. It's exactly the time and place, I interrupted, turning to Jackson. Your father's death, it wasn't an accident, was it? Jackson's fork clattered to his plate. What are you talking about? I steeled myself. My father told me some things. about George, about your family's history. And I think your mother has been keeping secrets from you." "That's enough," Evelyn shrieked, standing abruptly. "I won't sit here and listen to these baseless accusations." But Jackson's eyes were locked on mine, confusion and hurt swirling in their depths. "Caroline, what do you know?" I reached for his hand, ignoring Evelyn's protests. "Jackson, I love you. But before we can move forward, we need the truth, all of it." The air crackled with tension as Jackson looked between his mother and me. In that moment, I knew our relationship hung in the balance. Whatever came next would change everything. "All right," Jackson said quietly. "Let's hear it. All of it." As I prepared to reveal what I knew, I silently prayed that our love would be strong enough to weather the storm that was about to break. The tension in Evelyn's lavish living room was palpable as Jackson and I settled onto the plush sofa. Evelyn perched on her favorite armchair, her eyes darting between us like a cornered animal. "I don't understand why we're here," Jackson said, his voice tight. "Caroline, you said you had something to tell me about my father's death. What's going on?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "Jackson, Now," Evelyn interrupted, her voice sickly sweet. "Let's not ruin this lovely evening with unpleasant topics. Caroline, dear, why don't you tell us about your latest case instead?" I felt a surge of anger. "No, Evelyn, we're here to talk about George." Evelyn's smile faltered. "I don't see why we need to dredge up the past. George's death was a tragic accident, nothing more." "Was it?" I challenged, reaching into my purse. My fingers closed around my phone, the voice recorder app ready. "Because I've heard some things that suggest otherwise." Jackson leaned forward, his face a mask of confusion and hurt. "What are you talking about, Caroline?" I turned to him, my heart breaking at the pain in his eyes. "Jackson, I love you, but there are things about your family, about your father's death, that you need to know." "That's enough," Evelyn snapped, standing abruptly. "I won't sit here and listen to these baseless accusations. Caroline, I think it's time you left." "I'm not going anywhere," I said firmly, pressing the record button on my phone. "Not until the truth comes out." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "Truth? You want the truth? Fine. The truth is you've never been good enough for my son. You're nothing but a gold digger, trying to worm your way into our family." "Mom?" Jackson exclaimed, shocked. But Evelyn was on a roll now, her carefully cultivated facade crumbling. "You think you can come in here and start asking questions about George? You have no idea what sacrifices I've made for this family, what I've had to do to protect Jackson." "Protect me from what?" Jackson demanded, standing now too. Evelyn faltered, realizing she'd said too much. "Nothing, darling. I just meant." "No more lies," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "Tell him the truth, Evelyn, about George's death, about Jackson's real father." The room fell silent. Jackson looked between his mother and me, his face a mix of confusion and dawning horror. "What is she talking about, Mom?" Evelyn's composure cracked entirely. "You ungrateful little witch," she hissed at me. "How dare you come into my home and try to destroy everything I've built? George was weak. He couldn't handle the pressures of our world. What I did for Jackson to give him the life he deserves." "What did you do?" Jackson whispered, his voice barely audible. I reached for his hand, but he pulled away, his eyes locked on his mother. Evelyn seemed to deflate, sinking back into her chair. "It was an accident," she murmured. "I never meant for George to die, but he was going to leave us, to ruin everything. I couldn't let that happen." The confession hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Jackson stumbled backward, his face ashen. You killed Dad?" Evelyn reached for him, but he recoiled. "Jackson, please. You have to understand. I did it for you, for us." I stood, moving towards Jackson, but he held up a hand, stopping me. "Don't," he said, his voice breaking. "Just don't." With that, he turned and fled the room. I heard the front door slam moments later. Evelyn and I stared at each other, the weight of what had just transpired settling over us. I reached into my purse, pulling out my phone. "I recorded everything," I said quietly. "It's over, Evelyn." Her eyes widened in fear, then narrowed with hatred. "This isn't over," she spat. "You've ruined everything." As I left the house, my mind raced. I had the truth now, but at what cost? Jackson was gone, devastated by the revelations. And Evelyn was dangerous, cornered. I knew in that moment that my next steps would determine not just my future, but Jackson's as well. The truth was out, but the real battle was just beginning. The days following the confrontation at Evelyn's house were a blur of unanswered calls and sleepless nights. Jackson had disappeared, leaving me to grapple with the fallout alone. I'd barely slept, jumping at every noise, half expecting Evelyn to burst through my door at any moment. When my phone rang on the third day, I nearly dropped it in my haste to answer. "Jackson?" "Caroline." Evelyn's icy voice sent a chill down my spine. "We need to talk. Come to the house, now." My instincts screamed at me to refuse, but concern for Jackson overrode my fear. "Is Jackson there?" "Just come," she snapped before hanging up. Heart pounding, I grabbed my phone with the damning recording and headed to the Thornton mansion. As I pulled up, I noticed Jackson's car in the driveway. Relief flooded through me, quickly followed by apprehension. What was I walking into? Evelyn opened the door before I could knock, her face a mask of cold fury. "In here," she said, leading me to the study. Jackson sat in an armchair, his face haggard and unshaven. He barely looked up as I entered. "Sit down, Caroline," Evelyn commanded, closing the door behind us. "It's time we settled this once and for all." I remained standing, my hand clutching my phone in my pocket. "Where have you been, Jackson? I've been worried sick." He finally met my gaze, his eyes hollow. I needed time to think about everything. Evelyn circled the room like a predator. "Yes, and we've had quite the enlightening conversation, haven't we, darling?" "What's going on?" I demanded, my anxiety spiking. "What's going on," Evelyn said, her voice dangerously low, "is that you're going to hand over that recording and walk away. Forever." I stiffened. "And why would I do that?" "Because," she smiled, a triumphant glint in her eye, "if you don't, I'll make sure Jackson loses everything. His career, his reputation, everything." "You can't do that," I protested, but doubt crept in. Evelyn's influence ran deep. "Can't I?" she challenged. "One word from me, and every firm in this city will blacklist him, and that's just the beginning." I turned to Jackson, desperate. "You can't let her do this. We have proof of what she did." He looked away, defeated. "It's not just about me, Caroline. There are other people involved, other secrets. If this gets out, it'll destroy more than just our family." Evelyn pressed her advantage. "You see? You're out of your depth, dear. This is bigger than you can imagine. Now, be a good girl and hand over the phone." My mind raced. Everything I'd fought for, the truth I'd uncovered, was I really going to let it all go? But looking at Jackson's broken expression, I realized the cost might be too high. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone. "If I do this, you'll leave Jackson alone? Let him live his life?" Evelyn's eyes gleamed. "Of course, dear. That's all I've ever wanted." As I held out the phone, a sudden clarity struck me. This wasn't just about Jackson or me anymore. It was about justice, about the truth. In that moment, I made a decision that would change everything. "No," I said, pulling the phone back. "I won't let you win, Evelyn, not this time." Her face contorted with rage. "You little—" But I was already moving, darting for the door. Evelyn lunged, her nails raking my arm as I twisted away. I yanked the door open, only to find myself face to face with two stern-looking men in suits. "Caroline Thompson?" one asked, flashing a badge. "We're with the FBI. We need you to come with us." Behind me, I heard Evelyn's triumphant laugh. "I told you, dear, you're out of your depth." As the agents led me away, I caught one last glimpse of Jackson, his face a mix of anguish and something else. Was it resolve? The door closed behind us, and I realized with a sinking heart that the game had changed. Whatever came next, I was now playing for much higher stakes than I'd ever imagined. The fluorescent lights of the FBI interrogation room buzzed incessantly as I sat, my heart pounding. Hours had passed since they'd brought me in, and I'd refused to speak without my lawyer present. Finally, the door opened, and in walked Jackson, followed by a man I recognized as one of the top criminal defense attorneys in the city. "Caroline," Jackson said, his voice strained. "Are you okay?" I nodded, unable to find words. The attorney, Mr. Donovan, sat across from me. "Miss Thompson, I'm here to represent you. Now, let's hear what the FBI has to say." As if on cue, two agents entered. "Miss Thompson, we have some questions about your involvement with the Thornton family and certain financial irregularities." My mind raced. Financial irregularities? This had to be Evelyn's doing. "I don't know anything about that," I said firmly. The agent slid a folder across the table. "We have evidence suggesting otherwise. Large sums of money transferred to offshore accounts, all linked to you and Jackson Thornton." I gasped. looking at Jackson in disbelief. He avoided my gaze, his face a mask of guilt and fear. Mr. Donovan intervened. My client has no knowledge of these transactions. Now, unless you're charging her with something specific, we're leaving. The agent leaned forward. We're not done here. Miss Thompson, we know about the recording. Hand it over, and maybe we can make a deal. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. This wasn't about money laundering. It was about Evelyn's confession. Somehow, she'd manipulated the FBI into doing her dirty work. I steeled myself, making a split-second decision. I'll play the recording, I said, but only if Jackson and Mr. Donovan hear it too. The agents exchanged glances, then nodded. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone and pressed play. Evelyn's voice filled the room, her words damning and clear. As the recording played, I watched the color drain from Jackson's face. The agents listened intently, their expressions shifting from skepticism to shock. When it ended, silence hung heavy in the air. Jackson looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of pain and dawning realization. Caroline, I had no idea. All this time I thought... One of the agents cleared his throat. Miss Thompson, this recording changes things significantly. We'll need to verify its authenticity, but if it's genuine... It is, I said firmly, and I'm willing to testify to everything I know. Mr. Donovan leaned in. My client has clearly been the victim here. Any charges against her should be dropped immediately. The next few hours were a whirlwind of statements, paperwork, and hushed conversations. By the time we left the FBI building, the sun was rising, casting a surreal glow over the city. Jackson and I stood on the sidewalk, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on us. What now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He ran a hand through his hair, looking more vulnerable than I'd ever seen him. I don't know. Everything I thought I knew, it's all been a lie. My whole life, my family. I reached out, taking his hand. We'll figure it out together, if that's what you want. He squeezed my hand, a glimmer of the man I fell in love with shining through. It is. But Caroline, there's more you need to know. About my father, about who I really am. Before he could continue, a sleek black car pulled up beside us. The window rolled down, revealing Evelyn's face, twisted with fury. This isn't over, she hissed. You have no idea what you've done, what you've set in motion. As the car sped away, I felt a chill run down my spine. Jackson pulled me close, his body tense. We need to go somewhere safe, he said urgently. There are people who will do anything to keep the truth buried. Looking into his eyes, I realized that while we'd won this battle, the war was far from over. The truth about Jackson's paternity, the full extent of Evelyn's crimes, it was all still lurking in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. As we hurried down the street, I knew that our next steps would determine not just our future, but the fate of the entire Thornton legacy. The final confrontation was coming, and we had to be ready. The Thornton estate loomed before us, its grand facade now seeming more like a mausoleum than a home. Jackson's hand trembled in mine as we approached the front door. Inside we could hear raised voices, Evelyn and George, locked in a heated argument. Are you ready for this? I asked Jackson softly. He nodded, his jaw set. It's time for the truth, all of it. We entered without knocking. The shouting ceased abruptly as Evelyn and George turned to face us. Evelyn's face was a mask of fury, while George looked utterly defeated. You! Evelyn hissed, glaring at me. Haven't you done enough damage? Jackson stepped forward. It's over, Mom. We know everything. George sank into a chair, his face ashen. Son, I can explain. No need, Jackson interrupted. I had a paternity test done. I know you're not my biological father. The room fell silent. Evelyn's composure cracked, tears welling in her eyes. Jackson, please. Everything I did for you. I couldn't stay silent any longer. You murdered your husband, Evelyn. You've manipulated and lied for years. How is that for Jackson's benefit? George looked up, shock evident on his face. Murdered? Evelyn, what is she talking about? Jackson pulled out a folder. It's all here, Dad. The truth about my birth, about your brother Richard, about everything. As Jackson laid out the evidence, bank statements, medical records, and my damning recording, I watched the last vestiges of the Thornton family crumble. George's face cycled through disbelief, anger, and finally a deep, abiding sorrow. Evelyn, cornered at last, lashed out. You ungrateful brats! Do you have any idea what I've sacrificed? The lengths I've gone to protect this family's legacy? By killing Dad's brother? By passing off his child as Dad's? Jackson's voice cracked. That's not protection, Mom. That's destruction. I placed a hand on Jackson's arm, offering silent support as he continued. I'm done with the lies, the manipulation. I'm done with the Thornton name. Evelyn gasped. You can't mean that. You're a Thornton. No, Jackson said firmly. I'm not, and I never was. He turned to me, his eyes softening. Caroline, if you'll still have me, I'd like to take your name when we marry. Start fresh, build something honest. My heart swelled. Despite everything, our love had endured. Of course, I whispered, squeezing his hand. George stood slowly, looking years older than he had just hours ago. Jackson, son, because you are my son, regardless of blood, I'm so sorry for everything. As George moved to embrace Jackson, Evelyn made a desperate lunge for the folder of evidence. I intercepted her, our bodies colliding. We grappled, and I felt a sharp pain in my side. Looking down, I saw a letter opener clutched in Evelyn's hand, its tip stained red. Caroline, Jackson cried out, rushing to my side. Everything happened in a blur after that. The police, summoned by George, arrived within minutes. Evelyn was led away in handcuffs, her perfectly manicured facade finally shattered completely. As paramedics tended to my wound, thankfully shallow, I watched the last chapter of the Thornton dynasty come to a close. Months later, as Jackson and I stood hand in hand before a judge, reciting our vows, I reflected on the tumultuous journey that had brought us here. The Thornton name was now a thing of the past, tarnished by scandal and tragedy. But from its ashes, something beautiful had emerged. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the judge declared. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson. As we sealed our union with a kiss, I knew that while the road ahead might not be easy, we would face it together, armed with truth, love, and the strength we'd forged through adversity. Evelyn's web of lies had finally unraveled, and in its place, a new legacy was beginning. One built on honesty, forgiveness, and the unbreakable bond between two people who had weathered the storm and emerged stronger for it. As we walked out of the courthouse into the bright sunshine, I smiled up at my husband. The future stretched before us, full of promise and hope. Whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together, as equals, as partners, as the Thompsons.